Imagine a world really being reshaped by artificial intelligence. I mean, self-driving cars just navigating our cities, doctors giving us personalized medical treatments, um, truly incredible breakthroughs popping up all over the place. It's an exciting vision, right?
It really is.
But there's this foundational question we often kind of skip over. What happens when these incredibly powerful AI systems start processing our most personal data?
Yeah, that's the critical pivot, isn't it? All this amazing potential for AI innovation, it just comes hand in hand with this huge responsibility for our privacy, our autonomy.
Absolutely. So today, we're diving deep into that exact intersection, which is frankly fascinating and just getting more vital every day. Artificial intelligence and personal data. And we'll be paying special attention to Europe's big data protection law, the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. Our goal really is to unpack how AI uses your personal information, the amazing opportunities it opens up, and also the very real significant risks it can introduce.
And to guide us through this deep dive, we'll be pulling out key insights from a pretty comprehensive study. It was published back in June 2020 by the European Parliamentary Research Service, the EPRS.
Okay.
And this wasn't just some academic paper. It was actually prepared as background material specifically for the members and staff of the European Parliament. So we're not just talking legal jargon here. It's really about trying to grasp the fabric of our digital future.
Right. So let's start with the basics then. What is AI really?
Yeah.
Beyond the buzzwords we always hear.
Well, broadly, yeah, it's about building machines that can do things that normally need human intelligence.
Okay.
But the EU Commission's high-level expert group on AI, the AIHLEDGE, they give a more precise definition. They talk about AI systems as software, sometimes hardware, designed by us, by humans,
Right.
that when you give them a complex goal, they act. They perceive their environment using data, they interpret that data, reason on what they've learned, and then decide the best actions to take. And crucially, they can use symbolic rules or learn numeric models and even adapt their behavior over time.
And the really key part of that definition for us, for our data, is how much these systems rely on data to perceive their environment, right? Everything from public info to our personal details.
Exactly, that's the fuel. And most AI systems you run into day to day, they probably only do a fraction of those things, like pattern recognition, think facial recognition, or spam filters, or language processing when you ask a smart speaker a question.
Or movie recommendations.
Yeah, exactly. Practical suggestions, like recommendations. But then you have things like self-driving cars that really do combine a lot of those abilities. And stepping back a bit, AI as a whole scientific field includes different approaches. Machine learning is a big one, which includes deep learning, but also machine reasoning, robotics. It's a broad church.
Okay, that makes sense. So AI systems use these complex functions. What about algorithms? We hear that word algorithm thrown around all the time. What's the connection there?
Right, good question. Algorithm is actually a much broader term. It's just, well, it's a sequence of clear instructions to do something, often mathematical.
So like a recipe.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
A very precise recipe. So every AI system contains algorithms, loads of them probably, but not every algorithm is AI. Think about an e-commerce site's AI. It uses tons of different algorithms for recommendations, pricing, logistics. But the whole system coordinating all that, you could almost see that as one giant complex algorithm itself.
Got it. And the algorithms that actually make the AI learn, those are the really important ones here.
Exactly. Those are the learning algorithms. They're the magic ingredient, if you like. They're the ones that actually modify the underlying algorithmic model. So, for example, they tweak the internal connections and weights inside a neural network, and they do that to continuously improve how the system performs. They literally teach the system to get better at its job.
And what fuels all this learning? It's data, right? And specifically personal data. This is where it really hits home. AI applications fundamentally rely on processing our personal data, both for training those machine learning systems in the first place, and then for making predictions or inferences about us as individuals.
Yeah, AI basically turns personal data into, well, valuable insights, commodities almost. And that allows for automated decision-making, even in really complex areas you wouldn't expect.
Yeah, and there are real benefits to that, aren't there? I mean, automated predictions can be cheaper, sometimes more precise, maybe even more impartial than humans.
They certainly can be. AI systems don't have the same psychological biases humans do, or at least they shouldn't if designed well, and you can test them rigorously for fairness in ways that are harder with people.
Okay, but, and this feels like a big but, These algorithmic decisions can also be flat out wrong. They can be discriminatory. They can just soak up and reproduce our own human biases.
Or even create new ones, yeah.
And even when they seem fair on the surface, just the fact that they're everywhere can lead to this feeling of constant surveillance, always being evaluated, being nudged, maybe even manipulated. It's a bit unsettling.
It is. And the sheer scale of the data involved is just mind-boggling. Get this. The number of connected devices went from about 12 billion in 2010 to roughly 28 billion by 2020.
Wow.
And the things, smart speakers, sensors, appliances, they now outnumber PCs and phones.
And what happens online in just 1 minute? It's wild. Like in 2019, every single minute saw millions of Google searches, hundreds of thousands of hours streamed on Netflix, millions of texts flying back and forth, hundreds of thousands of snaps created.
All generating data.
Exactly. And the total amount of data globally, the data sphere, it's projected to hit something like 175 zettabytes by 2025. I can't even properly picture how big that is. But it shows AI's enormous, almost like insatiable appetite for data.
That data is basically its food. And there are a few main ways AI eats it to learn. Probably the most common method is supervised learning.
Okay, supervised learning. So that's where the machine learns from examples that are already labeled by humans, like pictures tagged cat or dog.
Precisely. Or maybe loan applications from the past linked to whether the loan was approved and actually paid back.
Right.
And what's really crucial here, and maybe a bit concerning, is how these systems can learn to predict human decisions. Like, what would a judge decide about bail based on past cases? Or predict factual outcomes, like, will this person repay their loan?
Which immediately raises that question. Does the AI just learn the good parts, or does it learn all the biases from the humans who label the data?
Exactly. A simple human bias, like maybe drug offense always equals no bail. That can get baked right into the system's logic without anyone realizing. And if your training data isn't big enough or diverse enough, you can end up with these really questionable generalizations, like the system deciding young people always get rejected for loans just because the initial data skewed that way.
Okay. Then you mentioned unsupervised learning.
Right, that's different. Here, the AI learns without explicit labels. It just looks for patterns on its own. It might cluster similar things together, like finding all the news articles about the same topic without being told what the topic is beforehand.
And the third type was neural networks and deep learning. That sounds complex.
It is powerful, yeah. These systems are kind of structured loosely like a human brain, with artificial neurons that activate and adjust their connection strengths, their weights, as they learn. You see this a lot in things like image or face recognition. The learning algorithm keeps tweaking this network until it gets really good at the task. But that complexity often means, especially for your data, that these systems become sort of opaque. We call them black boxes.
Right, the black box problem. I've heard that term.
Yeah.
So unlike maybe a simple decision tree where you can follow the steps.
Exactly. With a decision tree, you can usually trace the logic, if this, then that. But with a deep neural network, it often works incredibly well, but it can be almost impossible to understand why it reached a specific conclusion about you. It just does.
And people are trying to figure out how to explain them.
Oh, yeah. There's a whole field called explainable AI, or XAI. They're trying different ways explaining the model's overall logic, inspecting its internal workings. But honestly, progress in making these complex neural networks truly understandable to humans has been pretty limited so far.
And is there a trade-off? Like, are the best performing ones often the hardest to explain?
That's often the case, yes. The systems that achieve the highest accuracy are frequently the most opaque. And that creates this real tension, doesn't it? Balancing performance against the need for transparency, especially when it's making decisions based on our personal information.
Definitely. Okay, so let's pivot a bit to the bigger picture, the opportunities and the risks when AI meets our personal data. On the opportunity side, AI, with all that data and computing power, can make incredibly accurate predictions. We see it everywhere, right?
Absolutely. Targeted advertising is the obvious one, but also assessing job applications, helping with medical diagnoses, figuring out creditworthiness, even predicting the likelihood someone might reoffend, which is used in some justice systems.
In zooming out, these applications, they really do offer substantial benefits.
Oh, for sure. Better access to information, cost savings for businesses and consumers, highly personalized services, potentially even better public management. Imagine AI helping scientists find completely new correlations in research data, or helping doctors tailor treatments just for you. The potential is huge.
Okay, but then there's the flip side, the risks. One clear one is job displacement, AI automating tasks, maybe making certain jobs obsolete or just less valuable.
It's the race against the machine idea, yeah. It's a genuine concern. Many people could find themselves pushed out of the job market, which could lead to, well, poverty and social exclusion on a large scale. Think about truck drivers in autonomous vehicles, or call center workers in chatbots.
It's a massive societal shift, potentially. And then there's algorithmic discrimination. You mentioned this can happen even if the AI isn't explicitly told to discriminate.
Right. It often happens through what's called disparate impact. It's more subtle. So maybe a hiring algorithm learns that people who went to certain universities get promoted faster, just based on historical data.
Okay.
But if those universities historically admitted fewer people from certain minority groups, the algorithm might inadvertently penalize applicants from those groups, even though ethnicity wasn't a direct input. The outcome is discriminatory, even if the intent wasn't there.
And we talked about how systems trained on past human decisions can just learn our existing biases.
Exactly. If historical hiring data reflects past sexism, for example, an AI trained on it might learn to prefer male candidates, even if gender isn't explicitly used as a feature. And like we said, if your training data doesn't properly represent everyone, the AI might just be less accurate for people from underrepresented groups.
There's a quote you mentioned,
Yeah.
Kathy O'Neill, about challenging these decisions.
Yes, she wrote a book called Weapons of Math Destruction, and she points out how incredibly hard it is for individuals to challenge these algorithmic decisions. Her quote is stark, she says, "The human victims of WMDs are held to a far higher standard of evidence than the algorithms themselves." Basically, the burden of proof is unfairly on the person harmed.
That's powerful. Is there a counter-argument, though? Can algorithms be better than humans sometimes?
Well, potentially, yes. The argument is that algorithms, unlike human biases, which can be hidden or unconscious, can be audited. You can examine the code, test the outputs rigorously, identify the flaws, and actually fix them to prevent unfair outcomes. So some argue AI could even be a positive force for equity if we manage it right.
So the takeaway isn't ban all automated decisions.
Not according to the source material, no. The alternative is often flawed, biased human decision-making. The suggestion seems to be finding the right integration, combining human judgment with automated tools, but always emphasizing human oversight and transparency.
Okay. Beyond discrimination, there's the whole issue of profiling. What exactly is that in this context?
Profiling here means using automated or semi-automated ways to process data, specifically to figure out correlations and patterns, and then using those resulting profiles to make decisions about people.
And the danger there.
It can lead to this feeling of pervasive surveillance, like you're constantly being watched and assessed. It enables insistent influence, think targeted ads that follow you everywhere, and it really impacts your sense of personal autonomy. Plus, it opens the door to potential deception and manipulation.
The Cambridge Analytica scandal is probably the most famous example of this, right?
It's a textbook case, absolutely.
Can you walk us through how that worked again? It was pretty shocking.
It was. So it started with around 320,000 U.S. voters being paid a little bit like $2 to $5 to take this online personality and political quiz.
Okay.
To take the quiz, they had to log in using their Facebook account. Crucially, the app they used didn't just collect their Facebook data likes, personal info, it also scraped data from their friends.
Without the friend's consent.
Largely, yes. So they ended up with raw Facebook data from over 50 million people.
Wow. Okay, then what?
Then they matched the personality quiz results with all that Facebook data, especially the likes, to figure out psychological patterns. What kinds of things do introverts like versus extroverts or people with certain political leanings? Finally, algorithms crunched all this, maybe combined it with voter registration records to create these incredibly detailed psychological profiles of voters, and then they could target those individuals with hyper-personalized political ads designed to push their specific buttons based on their inferred personality.
That's chilling.
And it leads to these bigger concepts, surveillance capitalism. And that's the idea that our everyday online interactions, even offline ones connected to tech, become raw material. Data collected constantly for profiling, personalization, running experiments on us, and ultimately controlling behavior for profit.
And there's a state version, too, the surveillance state.
Exactly. The Chinese social credit system is often cited as the prime example. It pulls together data from all sorts of sources, financial, social, legal, online activity, to give citizens a score.
And that score actually affects their lives.
Massively. It impacts access to loans, jobs, travel, even schools for their kids. It raises this really provocative question about whether such systems push people towards just being opportunistic, conforming to get a better score, rather than acting autonomously based on their own values.
It's not surprising that some tech companies have reacted to concerns about micro-targeted political ads, like Twitter banning them or Google restricting targeting options.
Yeah, there's definitely been some pushback and self-regulation, although the effectiveness is debated.
So given all these huge implications, the good and the bad, it seems obvious we need some kind of framework, right? Ethical rules, legal principles.
Absolutely. There's wide agreement on that. We need principles and maybe even sector-specific rules to support what people are calling human-centered AI. Things like respecting autonomy, preventing harm, ensuring fairness, and demanding that systems are explainable or explicable.
And the EU seems to be trying to balance this, promoting AI, but also protecting rights.
That's the stated goal, yes. They talk about building an ecosystem of excellence, basically, encouraging AI research and business, but doing it within an ecosystem of trust. Meaning ensuring AI is deployed in ways that align with fundamental rights and European values. So safeguarding privacy is key, ensuring transparency, promoting diversity, avoiding discrimination, thinking about societal well-being, having clear accountability, and also ensuring fair competition in the AI market itself.
Okay, so that brings us squarely back to the GDPR, Europe's big data protection law. How does it actually handle all this AI stuff?
Well, the general consensus from the EPRS study is that the GDPR actually provides a pretty meaningful foundation. It gives good indications for how to handle data protection in the context of AI.
So it doesn't need a massive overhaul just for AI?
Apparently not. The interpretation is generally that it doesn't inherently block AI development or put EU companies at a major disadvantage. Crucially, the feeling was that GDPR doesn't need fundamental changes just to cope with AI.
But you said generally. Are there tricky bits, gray areas?
Oh, definitely. There are plenty of AI-related data protection issues where the GDPR doesn't give a crystal clear yes or no answer. And that uncertainty, it creates risks, it adds costs, and yeah, it could potentially slow down development or adoption.
So what's needed then? More guidance.
That seems to be the conclusion. Clearer guidance is needed for both the companies using AI, the controllers, and for us, the data subjects, on how to apply AI consistently with the GDPR rules. And getting that guidance right, that requires a big conversation involving regulators, civil society, academics, industry, everyone.
Okay, let's dig into some specific GDPR principles then. How do they apply to AI? First up, purpose limitation. What's that about?
So, this basically means data collected for one specific reason shouldn't just be reused for any other reason later on, especially if the new reason is incompatible with the original one.
But what about using data for research? Or training AI?
That's where it gets interesting. Reusing data for statistical purposes or scientific research is generally considered compatible under GDPR. Now, what's really relevant here for AI training is this. Even though adding your data to a massive training set might not seem like it directly affects you personally right then and there.
Right, it's anonymized. Or should be.
Well, ideally, yes. But there's still a risk of misuse down the line, which makes things like anonymization, or at least pseudonymization, where direct identifiers are removed but data could potentially be linked back, absolutely crucial.
Okay. Next principle, data minimization. Does that just mean using less data?
Not quite, or not just that. In the context of AI, which often needs huge amounts of data to work well, data minimization is interpreted more as reducing the personality of the data.
Sure.
Meaning, using techniques like pseudonymization or aggregation to make it harder to link data back to a specific individual while still allowing the AI to learn useful patterns from the data overall.
But you mentioned anonymization.
Yeah.
Does that actually work? Can data be truly anonymized?
That's a huge issue. The problem is re-identification. There are many, many cases where data sets that were supposed to be anonymous were actually de-anonymized.
Like how?
Well, the study mentions examples. German browsing histories were anonymized, but journalists managed to re-identify politicians by linking the data to public information. Australian medical records, supposedly anonymized, were re-identified. Even the MA governor's health record was famously re-identified using just 3 pieces of publicly available info: birth date, zip code, and gender.
Wow.
And remember the Netflix prize, they released a huge anonymized dataset of movie ratings for a competition. Researchers showed they could re-identify users just by cross-referencing it with public ratings on IMDb.
So if data can be re-identified, it's not really anonymous.
Exactly. And the moment it's re-identified, it instantly becomes personal data again, subject to all the strict GDPR rules. It seriously calls into question how effective our current anonymization techniques really are, especially with the power of modern AI to find patterns.
Okay, that's a big challenge. What about accuracy? That seems straightforward.
It is, but it's vital. Personal data used to train or feed an AI system has to be accurate. If the input data is wrong, the AI's inferences or decisions based on it could be wrong too, and that could cause real harm.
Makes sense. And storage limitation.
Yeah.
Keeping data only as long as needed.
Yeah, that's the principle. Don't hoard data forever. This obviously creates some tension with AI's hunger for large historical data sets for training.
Well, you said research gets some leeway.
Right. Using data for statistical or research purposes allows for potentially longer storage periods under GDPR, but again, with safeguards in place.
Okay, let's talk about the legal permission slip for processing data with AI. What are the legal bases? Consent is the big one we usually hear about, right?
It is, and it's key in traditional data protection. But for a lot of complex AI processing, consent gets tricky. Some argue it's often meaningless.
Why meaningless?
Well, think about it. The processing can be so complex, can you really give informed consent if you don't fully understand what's happening behind the scenes? Plus, often there's no real choice. If you don't consent, you might just lose access to the service entirely. Is that truly free consent?
Good point.
And paradoxically, relying only on consent given for one specific purpose might block potentially beneficial future uses of the data, like for research, that weren't anticipated at the time.
But isn't there a push for clearer consent, like opt-in, opt-out buttons?
Absolutely. Implementing user-friendly, clear choices is crucial. California's "do not sell my data" button is one example, and GDPR itself is clear. Consent isn't valid if you're forced to agree to data processing that isn't actually necessary for the service you're trying to use.
So consent isn't always the answer for AI.
Often, no. It's frequently insufficient on its own. That means companies using AI often need to rely on other legal bases allowed by GDPR, like proving the processing is necessary for a contract they have with you, or demonstrating they have a legitimate interest that outweighs your privacy rights, which involves a careful balancing act.
And what about repurposing data? Using it for something new?
GDPR allows that if the new purpose is compatible with the original one for which the data was collected, and importantly, if there's still a valid legal basis for that new processing. As we mentioned, statistical processing is generally seen as compatible.
Okay, but what if the AI infers something sensitive about me from non-sensitive data, like guessing my health status from my shopping habits?
That's a critical point. AI is very good at that. And under GDPR, if an AI infers sensitive data about your health, sexual orientation, political opinions, religious beliefs, even from seemingly innocuous data, then that inference itself counts as processing sensitive data, which means it needs to meet much stricter legal conditions under GDPR. You generally need explicit consent, or one of a few very specific exceptions, to process sensitive data. So just because the input wasn't sensitive doesn't mean the output gets a free pass.
Right, that makes sense. Okay, this leads us nicely into data, subject rights, our rights, and the whole issue of transparency with AI. You said AI can be a black box.
Yeah, and that complexity, especially with machine learning, makes transparency really, really difficult, both before you give your data, ex ante, and after the AI makes a decision about you, ex post.
So ex ante, before it happens, what should we ideally know?
Ideally, you should know what kind of input data the system is looking at, what sort of conclusions or scores it's trying to calculate, and what the potential consequences are for you. Like, is this system deciding if I get a loan or not?
And ex post, after the decision. GDPR says we have a right to information.
It does. For automated decisions, GDPR requires controllers to provide meaningful information about the logic involved, as well as the significance and the envisaged consequences of that decision for you.
But what does meaningful information about the logic actually mean? Does it mean they have to explain the entire algorithm?
That's the million-dollar question. It's ambiguous. Does it mean just general info about how the system works overall, or does it mean a specific explanation tailored to your individual case, explaining why you got that particular outcome? The law isn't perfectly clear.
And seeing the training data could help find biases.
It could, yeah. Access to training data is important for researchers and auditors trying to identify bias. There's also this idea of citizens being able to do black box tinkering, like inputting slightly different data to see how the output changes. But realistically, the effectiveness of that for an average person is probably pretty limited.
Okay, so what about our specific rights regarding automated decision-making? Does GDPR let AI make important decisions about us on its own?
Generally, no. The starting point in GDPR, Article 22, is that you have the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing, including profiling, if that decision produces legal effects concerning you or similarly significantly affects you.
What counts as a significant effect?
Things like an automatic refusal of an online credit application or e-recruiting practices where there's no human intervention at all. It has to be something genuinely impactful on your life or rights.
But there are exceptions.
Yes, there are. The prohibition on solely automated decisions doesn't apply if the decision is necessary for entering into or performing a contract between you and the controller, if it's authorized by EU or national law, or if it's based on your explicit consent.
Okay, but even when those exceptions apply, there have to be safeguards.
Absolutely. If a solely automated decision is made under one of those exceptions, GDPR demands suitable safeguard measures. Article 22.3 says these must at least include the right for you to obtain human intervention, to express your point of view, and to contest the decision.
And you mentioned Recital 71 adds a right to an explanation.
It does suggest that safeguards should include the right to get an explanation of the decision reached after such assessment. So is there a formal right to explanation in the law? It's heavily debated among lawyers and academics.
But if it exists, it would help you contest the decision.
It certainly could, yeah. It strengthens that right to contest. But, just like with consent, getting an individual explanation might not always be truly effective protection. There's often a big power imbalance, and most people lack the technical expertise to really challenge a complex algorithmic explanation, even if they get one.
That makes sense. What about the right to fix mistakes? If the AI gets something wrong about me?
Now, this is fascinating. GDPR obviously gives you the right to rectify inaccurate factual data they hold about you. But what about inferred information?
Like the AI's prediction about me.
Exactly. What if a statistical inference the AI made about you is just wrong? Or what if you have specific information about yourself that contradicts the general pattern the AI found? For example, maybe you're a top student at a university, but the AI disadvantages you because, statistically, graduates from that university tend to have lower salaries.
Should you be able to challenge that inference?
The argument is yes. You should have the right to contest that probabilistic conclusion, to provide your additional data, and potentially have the inference rectified. It goes beyond just fixing a typo in your address. It's about challenging the AI's judgment.
That's a really important nuance. What about preventing problems in the first place? Privacy by design.
Yes, GDPR heavily emphasizes that. Controllers need to build data protection into their systems from the ground up, using technical and organizational measures to ensure, by default, they only process data that's necessary for the purpose.
And for risky AI.
For AI processing considered high risk to individuals' rights and freedoms, GDPR mandates a data protection impact assessment, or DPIA, before the processing starts. And organizations doing large-scale systematic monitoring, which many AI applications involve, need to appoint a data protection officer, or DPO.
Are there things like certifications for AI to show it's trustworthy?
There's talk about it. Codes of conduct and certification mechanisms are relevant under GDPR. There have been calls for something like a European Trusted AI Business Certificate, but actually creating and managing such a thing is complex.
Okay, let's circle back to AI for statistical processing and scientific research. You said GDPR is generally okay with this.
Yes, it recognizes the huge potential here. Using AI and big data for science, for statistics like improving medical diagnoses or understanding economic trends offers massive benefits. And the general statistical results from that kind of analysis usually aren't considered personal data.
So GDPR allows repurposing data for this.
It does, generally treating it as a compatible purpose provided appropriate safeguards are used, like pseudonymization. National laws can also create specific derogations, meaning exceptions from some data subject rights, like access or erasure, when data is used solely for research or statistics to avoid hindering important work.
So it's seen as a way to get the benefits of AI and big data in Europe without ditching data protection.
That seems to be the balance they're aiming for. Enable beneficial uses while keeping safeguards strong. And now this does raise another interesting question.
Which is?
Should the anonymized or pseudonymized data sets that support these valuable statistical inferences be made accessible to third parties, like other researchers or competitors? How do you balance enabling further innovation and competition against the potential risks of misuse or re-identification if you share the data more widely? That's another ongoing debate.
Right, complex trade-offs.
Yeah.
Finally, what about enforcing these rights? Can people team up if an AI system affects lots of them negatively? Collective enforcement.
Currently, that's difficult under GDPR itself. The European Court of Justice has ruled, notably in cases involving Max Schrems against Facebook, that you generally can't combine your individual data protection claim with claims for other consumers in similar situations within the same lawsuit under GDPR rules.
But that might change.
There's potential for change, yes. The study mentions a proposed EU directive focused on collective redress for consumers across various areas. If that goes through and applies strongly to data protection, it could enable large-scale collective actions or class actions regarding AI harms. That would be a really significant development given how many people can be affected by a single algorithmic system.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot of ground here. So pulling it all together, what does this all really mean for us, for you listening?
Well, I think what we've seen is that AI, powered by our personal data, offers these truly incredible opportunities for progress, no doubt about it. But at the same time, it introduces some really profound risks to our individual rights, our privacy, fairness, autonomy, even to broader societal values.
And the GDPR. It provides a solid foundation.
It does. It gives us core principles like purpose limitation, data minimization, accuracy, and it lays out fundamental rights for data subjects when faced with automated systems. But as we've explored, the sheer complexity of AI, especially things like machine learning and the black box problem, means there are still lots of unanswered questions, lots of gray areas. It's this really dynamic space where the law and the technology are constantly trying to catch up with each other.
So this deep dive, it's not just about understanding the rules or the tech specs, is it?
Not at all. I think the bigger takeaway is recognizing that the choices we make about how we develop and deploy AI and how we regulate its use of personal data, these are fundamentally political choices with a small p.
Political in what sense?
In the sense that they actively shape the kind of society we want to live in. They determine the arrangements of power, who has opportunities, who might be excluded. Finding that balance between encouraging innovation, the ecosystem of excellence, and protecting individuals and our core values, the ecosystem of trust, that's not a one-time fix. It's this ongoing, evolving challenge.
And it needs more than just tech experts talking about it.
Absolutely. It demands a broad, inclusive discussion. We all have a stake in this. So maybe the final thought to leave you with is this. As AI continues to weave itself into the fabric of our lives, how will you participate in that vital conversation about shaping our digital future?